Seti means the land of the bow, but we all know that bows existed in Egypt and other places around Africa. So why exactly was this place located as the land of the bow? It's because of their reputation. Apparently, their skill was beyond that of any other person in the world, including places in Asia where the skills of the bow were being perfected over and over again. Now, we tend to think that this was something to do with the ancient world. It died with the ancient world, and then in the more modern world, people just forgot about that and they continued to be Nubian in a completely different way. Now, there are several kingdoms that existed within the region, and possibly the oldest one that is related to the ancient Egyptians directly and even referred to by the Muslims as living the way that ancient Egyptians lived was the Beja. But let's ignore those for a second and talk about the kingdom of Nubia and why some of the people who lived much later said that this kingdom had people who had bow and arrows so accurate that they could pinpoint any target. But I want to start with this person here who is holding the bow. And the reason why it's important to have this person be in the frame is because it's obvious that it's not one side of the Nubians that are skilled with the bow, but instead the entire Nubians seem to have this reputation. Later on, we would see other depictions of bowmen precisely from Nubia doing exactly what they did. They're so good that, of course, again, the Medjay were employed as police people to guard the desert lands and some of the inlands for the ancient Egyptians, given how talented they were with their weapons. During Ramses II's time, there is something very interesting about the depiction of Ramses II. The first is clearly he is learning from his enemies and he uses a lot of their weapons. The cart from Asia, the horse drawn cart, and the bow from Nubia. But something people don't realize is that a lot of Nubians were actually working with him, charging other Nubians. It's possible that some of the Nubians, especially those not falling over carrying the bow in this image, are actually on the side of the Egyptians. It's actually possible that this is not fully depicting the crushing of all the Nubians, but a crushing where they marshaled the Nubians against each other because the other Nubians represented the Egyptians in some way. If you notice, there are some who are tossed over, some running for their life, and then you also notice some look very comfortable holding their bows in their hand and traveling, some even looking like, oh, look at that, it's Ramses. Another reference to the bow is also made when he is holding this bow, this image, usually of the Egyptian crushing the enemy of Egypt, usually does not include a bow. But in this case, it does, and it might just be a symbol of the people of the land of the bow. Now, why would I say that some of those Nubians were probably on the side of Ramses? Well, let's take a picture or let's take a look at this picture of Tutankhamun crushing the enemies from Nubia. You will notice a couple things that's going on here. While all the people that are being crushed are from Nubia, you will see that there are some Egyptians inlaid in this who are lighter brown, like a very lighter brown, and they are stabbing and going through. So the people that are being crushed are the people falling over holding their cowhide shields, and they're being crushed under the wheels and stuff like that. But if you look just behind Tutankhamun, you can see that there's three Nubians who are fanning him. And in order to be fanning him, they'd have to be on his side. And then behind him would be other people who are marshaled, probably Egyptians, based on how they're dressed and the color that they're given. And to show that it's not a purely Nubian thing, we can see here that the Asiatics, their bodies have been scattered and really piled together. But you can see right at the top, there's an Egyptian holding a shield, and he is perfectly fine. Then you can see every other person. So inside, there are some people who are Egyptian, but they're not being destroyed. And you can kind of tell because of their shields, which are also kind of hides. But you can see behind the pharaoh that you have the same two Nubians fanning him. Now, it made sense in the previous one that there were Nubians, because of course they were marshaled against the Nubians. If we were going to assume that the reason why they're Nubians is because they're going against Nubians, so they want to show complete submission. Well, in this case, it doesn't make any sense because the people who they're charging against are the Asiatics. Now, of course, I understand the problem with saying that the lighter skinned ones are Egyptians and the darker skinned ones are Nubians, but I'm trying to make it very simple in this case. Now, what you notice in those other images is that the ancient Egyptians are standing erect and they are holding their weapon at the enemy. Is it possible that in this image, the people, the Nubians that are standing erect and holding their weapons, they haven't given them up? Is it possible that they're actually on the side of the ancient Egyptians? And even the way they're facing, I mean, most of them are facing towards that direction, except a few. Now, again, I might be fully mistaken and they might all just be running away, but it seems like they're way too comfortable, especially when I compare this image to all other images of crushings where this type of image, which is very glorious indeed, it only shows people being thrown around and the enemy and then everybody else looking kind of comfortable when they're on the side of the pharaoh. So it's possible that what we're looking here is at seti people, people of the bow, who have been used in the armies of the ancient Egyptians, and their usefulness is very prominent in this image, if it's true. Couple problems though. They're not dressed like Egyptians, so that might be an indicator that they're actually just the enemy. And of course, there is writing that goes along with this, which, we have to look into that before we make any real assumptions. If this is true, then we are looking at a fusion of weapons. The bow, perfectly made for the type of chariot that he rides, probably using Nubian tactics, marshaling Nubian men who, if you notice their bows, they sort of look the same as the one that he's holding. They don't look very different. And then, secondly, the chariot and the horse. This image looks very Egyptian, but at this time, it actually is probably slightly foreign. And it must be from this time that this image is really set as a pure Egyptian image, because of course the chariot and the horse didn't exist for a long time within Egypt. Bow and arrows, of course, existed all over the place, but The thing that is different is that Egypt didn't call itself Seti. It didn't call every part of Egypt Seti. It called Seti. While there are no bows and arrows in this image, we know that these people are warriors, and the person standing at the back is a Nubian. Now, don't get alarmed that his skin color is exactly the same as the rest of the Egyptians, and only the hair of the Nubian seems to be different than that of the Egyptians. The only thing that really matters is that it's proof that Nubians, especially Medjay, would be in charge of some trips when it came to war and tactics for the ancient Egyptians. And in this case, we see him almost look like he is the captain of the Egyptians. More images of Nubians carrying bow and arrows. As you can see, the arrow that are carried are plenty in their hand, and then they carrying the bow. More proof, and of course they're wearing that tie thing around their waist that you see in so many other depictions of Nubians. And they've got the typical Nubian hair, which you also see. This is why I wonder sometimes why they don't assume all of those guys are Nubian. As you can see, they look slightly similar. Now, of course, the giveaway might be, and this is the point of the video anyway, the giveaway might be that the Egyptians are carrying smaller weapons, close combat weapons, and the Nubians, because they're gifted in the art of the bow, are the ones who are charging with bow and arrows. Now, do we have any real answer, or do we have any real evidence that these people were good with the bow outside of ancient Egypt, outside of ancient Greeks who were just writing about what the ancient Egyptians said? And of course, they had personal experience with the bowmen in ancient Egypt. We also have that evidence in the 800s AD in the form of a Muslim writer who talks about a specific encounter. So before I go back to the Greeks and the ancient Egyptians, let's read that encounter. So, first, in the very early days, we see that the Muslims were going against the Nubian just converted Christians. And this is what one of the Muslims had to say. The nature and the number of early Muslim attacks is not clear from the Arabic accounts. There were probably at least two major campaigns, one in 641 and the other in 651. The first campaign was met with stout resistance from the famous Nubian bowmen. Okay, now this is what the Muslim has to say. The first part was just prefacing his statement. A Hammerite elder who claims to have participated in two expeditions against the Nubians in the time of Amir B al-As relates. Okay, here we go. Quote unquote. There were no warriors as brave as they are. I saw one of them asking a Muslim, in which part of your body do you want me to put my arrow? Remember, this is during a war, and this Nubian looks at a Muslim from Egypt and says, which part of your body do you want me to hit? And confidently, the Muslim says, because he knows that arrows have limits, so he confidently points to a part of body. And when the Muslim shows him a certain spot, he would not miss it. Indeed, the resistance was so strong and the booty was so meager that the Muslims asked Amir B al-As to make peace. Amir rejected the idea, and the Arabs continued their campaign until 651, when Abd Allah bin, the governor of Egypt, marched with his force of 5,000 as far as Dongola. In the ensuing battles between the Arabs and the Nubians, the latter exhibited the same gallant fighting powers and were only scared by the catapults which bombarded their cathedral. The presence of this strange siege weapon prompted the Nubian king Khalid to ask for peace, having failed to defeat their enemies. So even though they were taken over, even though they were defeated, they were still championed for their weapon. Now, I could have read it from his book, but it's still written in the Islamic religion. But I will say that the, not the Islamic religion, still written in Arabic. And I will say that the Nubian that is in question here, the Nubian that is in question, it carries on and states that he does this several times. So the Nubian in question, the Arabs are confident, like, no, there's no way this guy can do this. I'm too far away, and then he gets them all the time, meaning that the skill of these people is well known, and we see someone from 641 AD saying this, at least 641 AD saying this. So their skill with the, as archers is still something that is looked at this time as a high skill amongst these people. Now, of course, no war can just be won by arrows. In fact, you want to see exactly what happened. Look at the ancient Egyptian Ramses image that I showed you. Though they were known as good archers, in that image they're shown being defeated. So of course their skill with the bow and arrow is it shines so brightly that even in loss they are praised. And remember, this is not them being praised by Muslims only. This is the ancient Greeks, the Romans, who during the time of the queen and during the time of the queens, they are said, yes, they had bow and arrows that we just couldn't go through because they were so precise with their weapon. We go back, we see Herodotus saying it as well, saying that the Nubians are very good with their arrows, especially the ones which are marshaled with the Asiatics under the Persians. And then, of course, we have the name Tasseti and so many other people, campaigns. I could show you stele after stele, which talks about how brave and strong they are with the bow and arrow. This means that it's probably not a myth. It's probably something that was a true fact. So I'll finish with two things in the Bible. One about Ethiopians, but one just about the bow in general, the bow and arrow in general. And this one is about how having kids in your youth it's like a comparison of having kids in your youth. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the gods stand watch in vain. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be put to shame when they contend with their opponents in court. By the time the Bible was written, even people in Ethiopia had been creating chariots of their own. And perhaps one of the best evidences of this is written in the Bible, where there's just an assumption that they have chariots. As we read, Asa had an army of 300,000 men from Judah, equipped with large shields and with spears, and 280,000 from Benjamin, armed with small shields and with bows. All these were brave fighting men. Zerah the Cushite, sometimes called the Ethiopian, marched out against them with an army of thousands upon thousands and 300 chariots, and came as far as Mareshah. Asa went out to meet him, and they took up battle position in the valley of Zephatha near Mareshah. Then Asa called to the Lord his God and said, Lord, there is no one like you who will help the powerless against the mighty. So, in spite of them having those large shields and bow and arrows, it seems like they are giving credit to the Cushites for being mighty in this case, that the only way they can win is through divine intervention. You are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you. The Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The Cushites fled, and Asa and his army pursued them as far as Gerar. Such a great number of the Cushites fell that they could not recover. They were crushed before the Lord and his forces. The men of Judah carried off a large amount of plunder. So, in conclusion, not only is it not a myth, but it seems to carry on throughout the ages, even to people who had never read the source material of the ancient Egyptians, because of course they couldn't read the ancient Egyptian languages, and to random Arabs who did not care about history. Even they had the same opinions about the Nubians and their skill with the arrows.